Well, greetings from Melbourne. It's a pleasure to be with my Greek friends again, even though I'm doing it from a very long way away. Just over a year ago, I was in Athens at the invitation of our ambassador, Jenny Bloomfield, who's with you today, and had the privilege to meet the Prime Minister and senior ministers of the government, and also senior representatives of business in a range of meetings and workshops and presentations. I must say that throughout all of that I was impressed by the openness that I observed among those I talked to the difficulties and the challenges confronting Greece, but also a resolve to overcome those difficulties. And I must say a willingness to listen to someone like me from a country a long way away and in rather different circumstances, but I should say a country that has very close relations with Greece and indeed has many Greek people living in it, including in my hometown of Melbourne here in Victoria. When I came to Athens last year, I was asked to speak about the reform experience in Australia, and how the structural reforms that we went through in the 80s and 90s in particular were instituted, explained, how they played out, and in particular what effect they had on the living standards of Australians. And the short answer to that is, while there were some short-term costs and disruptions that inevitably occur when there's reform, the Australian public has benefited enormously from those reforms in increases in living standards. Indeed, the average Australian household was $7,000 better off at the end of the reform era through the 90s than it was at the beginning. A key point that I thought I'd emphasise today, given the focus of your workshop or your round table, is that in Australia the reforms involve changes to policy, but also changes to the relationships between government and the private sector itself. We saw a change from special favours being granted to particular groups, which encouraged a rent-seeking culture in Australia, to an approach by government which was much more directed at reducing the impediments to all businesses throughout the country. We saw a shift from private deals to public processes that involved greater transparency and more debate, a kind of government that the OECD describes as open government, and that the OECD has emphasised is an important part of building trust in government itself. We also saw a change in Australia from what I'd call reactive policy making to much more strategic evidence-based policy making, an approach that focuses on understanding problems, testing options, and ultimately explaining the proposals that come out of that to the community and to the business community in particular. And above all, I think in Australia we saw an increased understanding within government that a vibrant private sector is the key to growth and increase in living standards. Social programs and redistribution through the tax and transfer systems, all of that is very important to a civilised society. But as I said when I was in Athens, and it got picked up I think in some of the press reporting, a government cannot redistribute what its economy does not produce. Ultimately, what a public sector can do in terms of redistribution and transfers and services is limited by the health of the private sector, and in particular the tax revenue that is derived from that. So a crucial insight, I think, from the Australian experience is that efficiency and equity go together. You need an efficient economy if you're to have an equitable society, and to use the fruits of that economic performance. Now, I must admit that in Australia we forget that lesson ourselves sometimes. It's something that requires continuing attention. Well, the key to raising production is to improve productivity, and Paul Krugman, the famous professor from MIT in the United States, has said that productivity isn't everything, but in the long run it's almost everything. Well, what did he mean by that? Essentially what he meant was that rises in living standards or per capita income growth is fundamentally dependent on the productivity of the economy, how much output we can get from our human capital and other inputs. It's the main driver of rising per capita incomes. Now, productivity is a micro, not a macro phenomenon. It's something that is addressed at the level of enterprises and organisations and in the mix of our industries. And one of the big changes that occurred in Australia was we saw the exit of less productive firms and we saw the growth of more productive, more competitive ones that could survive in a more competitive world. Now, how productive a firm will be depends on the skill of its managers, of course, but managers themselves are influenced by government in a number of ways. There are three main ways, indeed, that government can influence the performance of firms through the incentives that are provided to managers to be more productive, through the capabilities or capacities that they have at their command in terms of human and organisational capital and infrastructure and so on. And thirdly, by the flexibility that they have to make the changes that they need to make to survive in a very competitive world. Well, in Australia, we saw changes in both regulation and spending behaviours of government that had an emphasis on reducing red tape, on promoting competition, and improving the efficiency of infrastructure on which all enterprises depend. Well, the government also needs to improve its own productivity. In Greece, as in Australia, the government sector accounts for a large share of the economy. And there are two aspects of that improvement in the performance of government that I think relate to the theme of your meeting here today. And one is that, and it's come out of the Australian experience, that government should not be doing things that the private sector can do better. And when it's doing the things that it can do and has a comparative advantage in doing, it needs to do those as efficiently as possible. So we saw in Australia, for example, major reforms in the infrastructure area, which used to be dominated by government trading enterprise monopolies. We saw those increasingly exposed to competition. We had corporatisation and more recently privatisation, which has led to a transformation in the performance of those infrastructure services. And the Productivity Commission, my previous organisation, calculated that Australia gained a 2.5% increase in its GDP from the reforms in those infrastructure areas in the way I described. Well, 2.5% of GDP is a lot, and Australians have greatly benefited from those reforms. Both the public and the private sectors have their strengths, and government certainly needs to harness the private sector's capacities in relation to innovation and cost reduction, which the private sector does far better than the government. At the same time, the government's role is to regulate and ensure that standards are met, that market power is not abused, and that financial stability can be assured. And when that partnership of respective responsibilities works well, we see an economy reap the benefits, as happened in Australia. So that doesn't mean that the government vacates the field in any way, but there's a change in the emphasis of what government does from a provider of goods and services to a contractor or regulator or facilitator of those things, harnessing the best of the private sector and the not-for-profit sector. Well, we're seeing big changes in these very areas occurring in Australia right now. We're seeing much more citizen engagement in service delivery, and we're seeing partnerships with the private and not-for-profit sectors increasing and going beyond the traditional public-private partnerships that occurred in economic infrastructure into areas of social policy delivery, health, community services, and so on. Now, my present organisation, the Australian and New Zealand School of Government, was created as a consortium, by a consortium of governments in Australia and New Zealand and universities to help governments build capability and to spread best practice across governments in Australia and New Zealand. And it was a pleasure in November to welcome two senior officials from the Greek administration to our course, the Executive Fellows Program, which is drawn on the Harvard program and has Harvard professors teaching in it. And I must say your two colleagues were great ambassadors for Greece, and they illustrated, their presence in Australia, I think, illustrated that learning is a two-way street, and that's something that no country can afford to ignore. So I wish you well in your deliberations today. I also wish Greece well in its future reforms. And I think, as I said, that its success over time will depend on how well the private and public sectors can complement each other in delivering higher incomes for people, and indeed building trust between the two sectors, which ultimately the trust of the wider public depends on. So thank you very much. Once again, I wish you a very productive exchange today, and greetings again from Melbourne in Australia.